The 1960s ushered in a period of escalating international and domestic tensions. The Cold War was becoming more complex as the United States worked to contain communism around the world, including highly charged incidents in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. Simultaneously, the United States was faced with internal racial strife. Both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations implemented foreign and domestic policies that had significant influences on the events of the 1960s, including war, technology, and social change. The United States continued to be guided in its approach to foreign affairs by the Truman Doctrine, which emphasized the importance of containing communism. The 1960s was a time when the Cold War escalated to what could have potentially become direct military action between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations were equipped with massive nuclear capability that threatened the safety of the entire world. The period was tense, dangerous, and became internally divisive as Americans disagreed with one another about the merits of military involvement in distant locations. Cuba, a Caribbean island just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was also a major trade partner and tourist destination for Americans. In 1958, a communist revolution overthrew the Cuban government, and its leader, Fidel Castro, named himself president for life. Castro's plans to nationalize foreign businesses and land reform policies alienated American businessmen and Cuba's wealthy citizens. The United States responded by applying economic sanctions against Cuba. The United States began planning for the overthrow of Fidel Castro after realizing that Cuba's new leader had become a communist. Unwilling to be seen as directly involved in the overthrow of a populist government such as Castro's, the United States used the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, to train and carry out a coup against the Castro government. The plan was to land along the Bay of Pigs and use U.S.-supplied aircraft to support the landing. On April 5, 1961, Cuban exiles landed but were crushed by the Cuban Army and Air Force. The newly elected Kennedy administration refused to use U.S. air support to cover the invasion forces. Captured exiles revealed the U.S. backing, and Castro went to the Soviet Union for military and economic support. The Soviet Union saw Castro's gesture as a way to expand the Cold War into the Western Hemisphere and to throw U.S. strategic planners off their game. The relationship between the United States and Cuba was further strained in 1962, when Castro allowed the installation of medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Soviet government was worried that U.S. nuclear weapons held a tactical and strategic edge over their own stockpile. The Soviet government decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba in order to shorten the time that Soviet missiles would have to reach targets in the U.S. These missiles would have placed most of the United States, Canada, and Latin America within the range of attack. Castro saw the placement of Soviet missile batteries and their supporting troops as a way of preventing future interference in Cuban affairs by the United States. When the missiles were discovered, the Kennedy administration ordered a naval blockade on Cuba, rather than a direct military strike on the missiles. The president feared that such an attack would escalate into an all-out war with the Soviets. As nuclear warheads made their way to Cuba on Soviet ships, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba if the United States would secretly withdraw its missiles from Turkey and pledge not to invade Cuba. Both sides agreed, and the crisis was concluded after 13 days of uncertainty. Kennedy emerged from the crisis with renewed public confidence after the missteps of the Bay of Pigs had hurt his approval ratings the year before. Another dramatic escalation in Cold War tension emerged in Southeast Asia. Vietnam became the site of a long struggle between communist and non-communist forces, each aided by their respective ideological superpower. Vietnam had been a colony of France during the late 19th century. The Japanese seized the region during World War II. In response to the takeover, the the Vietnamese people organized a resistance movement known as the Viet Minh. They warred against both the Japanese and French. The organization was dominated by the Communist Party and led by Ho Chi Minh. When World War II ended, the French assumed they would regain control of the region. The Viet Minh resisted the takeover and defeated the French in 1954. The United Nations attempted to broker the creation of new nations in what had been French Indochina. The nations of Cambodia and Laos were created. However, the people of southern Vietnam did not want to be ruled from Hanoi in the north and did not wish to be communist. The United Nations divided the nation at the 17th parallel and planned for an election that was to be held 2 years later to decide the unification of the North and South. The South Vietnamese government rejected an all-Vietnam election because a communist-backed guerrilla movement, the Viet Cong, had begun a terror campaign in the South. The Viet Cong targeted village chiefs, school teachers, and government officials. South Vietnam requested and received U.S. military support in the form of training for its armed forces. The United States believed a communist takeover of South Vietnam would lead to further expansion of communism in Asia. President Eisenhower invoked the image of a row of falling dominoes, thereafter termed the domino theory. In keeping with the U.S. policy of containment, the United States began its involvement in Southeast Asia. The United States increased aid, but remained largely in an advisory role under President John Kennedy. But the United States assisted in a 1963 coup against the perceived weak South Vietnamese government. In the ensuing chaos that followed the coup, communist forces were able to strengthen their hold over South Vietnam. United States naval units in the Gulf of Tonkin supported the South Vietnamese Marine and naval units as they staged a series of raids into North Vietnam. On August 2, 1964, North Vietnamese naval vessels were accused of attacking the U.S. Navy destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy. President Johnson responded by ordering an air attack on North Vietnamese naval bases. Prior to the U.S. attack, Johnson requested and received Congress's approval. Congress issued the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the President authorization to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong intensified their effort and decisively defeated larger South Vietnamese forces twice in 1964 and 1965. President Johnson made a marked change in U.S. policy by placing ground troops into combat in South Vietnam. The United States sent troops to Vietnam to protect its bases. This increase in troop strength gradually grew to more than 500,000 men by 1968. The growth of U.S. military influence in the region led the communist strongholds of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China to give North Vietnam military aid. The U.S. took action in both Cuba and Vietnam to contain communism. The situation in Cuba could have easily escalated to direct conflict between the Soviet Union and the U.S., but that danger was averted when the Soviets backed down. The world was on the brink of yet another war, but the issue was resolved at the last minute. In Vietnam, the United States gradually increased its involvement in the region. Race relations and poverty in the United States continued to be major issues in the 1960s. The civil rights movement gained momentum following the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education. While Kennedy supported civil rights legislation, his efforts were blocked in the Congress by Southern opposition. Kennedy's assassination in 1963 had a significant effect on his domestic policy agenda, which became the responsibility of the new president, Lyndon Johnson. Following Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963, President Lyndon Johnson had the political capital to force his domestic legislative package through Congress. The civil rights legislation that Kennedy supported but had not been able to get passed in Congress was pushed through in 1964. Johnson depicted the passage of the proposed civil rights law as being one of the best ways to honor the dead president's legacy. Congress responded to the call to action and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation in American schools and other public places. The law formally ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and the racial segregation of schools, places of work, and facilities that served the general public. Later, the law's provisions were extended to include private work facilities and wage discrimination against women. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed the year after Congress moved on the issue of civil rights. This federal law made it illegal for African American voters to be disenfranchised through unfair voter registration criteria. It ended the practice of using literacy tests as a qualification to vote and mandated federal oversight of elections in the southern states. Johnson launched his Great Society program as a way of attacking the endemic problem of poverty in the United States. He believed that the United States' post-World War II prosperity could be harnessed to solve key quality of life issues. Johnson's Great Society programs involved some key initiatives. The War on Poverty. 40 programs intended to eliminate poverty by improving living conditions and enabling people to end the cycle of poverty. The Economic Opportunity Act was passed in 1964, which launched Johnson's War on Poverty. Education. 60 separate bills provided for new and better equipped classrooms, minority scholarships, and low-interest student loans. Medicare. Guaranteed health care to every American over 65 years of age. Medicaid. Provided health care assistance to the poor. Environment. Introduced measures to reclaim clean air and drinking water. National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities. Created with the philosophy that artists, performers, and writers were a valuable part of the United States' identity and deserved support. Job Corps. Provided job training for young men and women. Head Start. A program for 4- and 5-year-olds from disadvantaged families that gave them a chance to start school on an even basis with other children.